You want to kick us off? Yeah. The small and the mighty are left. It's good.
Good afternoon. Afterwards, we can poll whether Cherry Garcia or what was it, Rocky Road or Chocolate? Yeah. So we're here today to talk about climate change and housing. And this room is gathered because we all believe at a fundamental level that housing is a human right. I'm here today to talk about climate change as an existential threat to fair housing and sustainable and safe housing. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of that. In California 2 years ago, I heard the story of a woman who took her three children to a supermarket, shopped for groceries, and by the time she came out and drove back home, her home within that 90-minute period had gone from being safe to having burned down in a fire 5 years ago. In Detroit, 1 in 4 basements is flooded every night because of precipitous rain in homes owned by largely working class people of color. In Louisiana, hurricanes in the last 5 years have destroyed up to 80% of affordable housing stock in some cities. And so in the context of all of this challenge to homes and housing, homeowners, renters, voters, mayors, governors, millions of people around the country have started to talk about resilience. But the thing is that resilience means different things to different people. To some people, it means a spiritual reserve. Some people think of resilience as an engineering term. Some people think of resilience as materials, resilient bricks and plywood. Most people agree that resilience requires money, and indeed, Congress spends at this point over $10 billion a year on disaster recovery. $10 billion a year. It really represents one of our nation's largest continuous infrastructure projects. But the aspect of resilience very few people talk about is workers. The workers who literally have to be on the ground to build resilience. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to tell you the story of a new workforce that's emerging in America, is likely rebuilding homes in your neighborhoods, in your states. This is a workforce I call the resilience workforce. Their story starts in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. My name is Saket, Soni. I'm a labor organizer. And after Katrina, I started my days at 5 a.m. standing under a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee. In Lee's circle, under that statue, was where 500 workers gathered every morning who had come from around the country and around the world to rebuild homes after Katrina. The hurricane had made landfall in Mississippi, the levees had breached in Louisiana, and that tragedy left 1 million homes to be rebuilt in Louisiana, 1 million more to be rebuilt in Mississippi, and the laborers were people from around the country and around the world. And this migrant workforce that was rebuilding the Gulf Coast after Katrina, in the next decade would follow storm after storm after storm. Climate change made disasters more frequent and more destructive, and that meant that a labor force was needed to rebuild homes wherever hurricanes fell. So Houston, Baton Rouge, North Carolina, Florida, and then these workers who rebuilt New Orleans after Katrina, who followed storm after storm, started coming right here to California to rebuild homes after the fires. I've been embedded in this workforce for about 15 years. My team and I spend 6 months a year on the road with them. And what we see is that on one hand, there is increasing and exponentially increasing labor demand, and a huge amount of money, not just to rebuild homes after disasters, but to make them resilient, to face the shocks and stresses of the future. But where we're getting left behind is there aren't enough workers. The workers that there are vulnerable, they're exploited, they're undocumented, they're hanging by a thread, and there aren't enough of them. And so this is where we need systemic solutions. This is one of the ways that the climate crisis is an affordable housing crisis. And both those crises, we can be prepared better for both those crises if we build a workforce. So I want to talk to you about a few solutions. And before I do, I just want to say all I'm doing here is teeing up our incredible champion in Washington, Congresswoman Jayapal, who really has introduced the most visionary legislation that she will talk about that bring these priorities to life. But a couple of key things to consider here. One, how many of you own a home or live in a home? So all of you are constituents of my organization. All of you are constituents of this idea that the shocks and stresses of climate change need to now be undeniably something we plan for as we think about our built environment, including all the homes that are in it. And in order to do that, you need to plan to build a local workforce wherever you are. Cities are used to building firefighters. Cities are used to having firefighters and sanitation workers. Cities now need to get used to having resilience workers working year in and year out to make homes resilient. In Sonoma County, we're taking unemployed farm workers, just to give you an example of the kind of life-changing circumstances these workers can have. Unemployed farm workers who live in Sonoma County who are experiencing shorter and shorter harvest seasons over the course of the year because of climate change, who are earning $15, $16, $17 an hour, if that. And we're retraining them and launching them into resilience careers to harden homes and steward vegetation, to do land management. And they're starting these resilience careers at $35 an hour. $35 an hour. We have launched workers into careers that range from $24 to $27 an hour in Louisiana and Florida, not states notorious for their high wages. So as a policy matter, we need to institutionalize this workforce in the United States. Make sure that if housing is a human right, the right to resilient homes, the right to homes that are not going to be washed away the next time there is a flood, that too is guaranteed. Now, a second arena of policy is around racial disparities. We're all used to homes as shelter, and we think about that, but everyone in this room also thinks about homes as wealth. Well, in the course of the climate crisis, we're used to the idea that disasters hit people differently and unequally. But the other thing that happens is that recoveries hit people differently. Largely, white homeowners accrue wealth as a result of recoveries because of how the money works, because of the incentives. But black and brown homeowners, let alone renters, lose wealth. So another measure of policy is money flowing to municipalities to make sure that poor neighborhoods and working class neighborhoods are made resilient. And finally, I would say that the climate crisis, as much as we absolutely want to fight fossil fuels and reduce the amount of carbon, keep carbon in the ground, we also know that we're in a world where we have to adapt to the climate disasters that are in the future. Half of US zip codes belong in disaster-prone areas, half of US zip codes. And that means, as a matter of policy, we need to rewrite the rules of adaptation so that money for recoveries flows not only to wealthy cities, but to poor cities. So I'll close there, and I'll just say that our beacon in all of this, our champion, the first real pioneer in this whole arena of policy has been you, Representative Jayapal. We're very grateful. Thank you so much.
Saket Soni. He's really brilliant, and if you haven't read his book, I would really recommend you go get it. I could not put it down.
Thank you.
I literally could not put it down, and it goes back and traces his work with resilience workers, with immigrant workers who came over from India. It is really a phenomenal book, so please go out and buy it. So Saket has sort of laid the groundwork for what we're talking about. And you know, when we think about climate change and we think about how much we spend, I'm not talking about all of the other impacts, but just how much we spend. In 2023 alone, we spent $178 billion on climate disasters. $178 billion. $98 billion of those were spent, $98 billion was spent on just 28 climate disasters. The average flood costs us about $1 billion. And you've heard about the disproportionate nature of where these disasters hit. It is also very true that none of these disasters is inevitable. We make it seem like it is inevitable. Certainly the planet is warming, that increases our risks, but our ability to plan for those disasters, our ability to actually utilize what is seen as a dramatic threat, and is a dramatic threat and crisis, is also an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for us to build resilient workforce and infrastructure that really meets the needs of our current planet and our current planetary change, and engages the very people who are least engaged and should be most engaged. And so when Saket came to me with this, sort of all the work that was being done, and how do you create a federal bill around this, what we realized very quickly is that unlike many pieces of legislation that just focus on one area, what we needed to do in this instance was really focus on 4 different but very interrelated and intersectional areas. The first, of course, is climate change. This is all about how do we deal with the effects of climate change? How do we plan for it? How do we prepare for it? The second was labor. What is the workforce that is already doing the work, by the way, already doing the work, but how do we ensure that that workforce is getting the training they need, getting the wages they need, and removing the barriers to employment that are currently there for the workforce that we do have. The third is, related to that, is immigration. I've worked on immigration for 20 years, but this is very key because if you look at the current workforce that is engaged, it is largely people who have been formerly incarcerated and largely immigrant. And so we're addressing both of those things, the incarceration within the barriers to employment, but immigration is kind of a whole issue where we felt like that needed to be a piece of this as well in order to build the workforce we're talking about. And then finally, what did I say? Immigration, barriers to employment, labor. I'm missing one that I can't think of right now, but it'll come to me. So this is an intersectional bill that is really trying to think about all of the pieces that need to be in place. And so the crux of the bill is, first of all, we provide real resources to municipalities to do climate resilience planning. What I found out going in even to Seattle, to my state, which is very good on climate change, we have a great governor on climate change, there is no real planning that is done, and there's no real money for planning that is done. Because of this bill, we now have a state agency that took the idea and has started to think about how to do climate resilience planning within our state government. So we're moving pieces of this idea along anyway. And so this bill would establish an Office of Climate Resilience within the White House. We are actually trying to get that done through executive order as well, that piece of it. But that office would then be able to distribute grants and money to local municipalities, to counties, to labor organizations, to nonprofit organizations, to help do that planning and making sure that the people who are most disproportionately affected by climate change are actually at the table. So that's one piece of it. The second piece is it has, on immigration, it has a path to citizenship for workers who are within this sector. Because think about this, right? This workforce is there. It is traveling. Saket is traveling with them for 6 months of the year. And they're going from disaster to disaster, and they are largely formerly incarcerated and immigrants. But they are working often under the table, or they're barred from working because they have to check a box that says that they've never committed a crime or been imprisoned. And so because of that, they are a very vulnerable and exploited workforce. They don't have the job, they don't have the protections and the benefits and the wages that they deserve. And so in this, we say, let's recognize the value of immigrant workers in the resilience workforce and provide a pathway to citizenship for that workforce. Third, around barriers to employment, which I sort of alluded to with the issue of folks who have been formerly incarcerated. We know what a huge barrier this is when you have to check that box and you are banned from even getting an interview sometimes, much less the job. And we also know that every time there's a disaster in many of these places, this is exactly the population that they're going to. They are bringing folks even out of the jails sometimes to do this rebuilding work. So what if we thought about this completely differently and said, this is an opportunity to build great union jobs and train people, train this workforce, make sure that we are bringing the benefits to the workforce, because this is also the community that is most disproportionately burdened by it. And then finally, there is a real emphasis on the job training piece of it. So there's a whole section around how do we provide the monies to invest in workforce training and all of the pieces that are required for people to really have the skills that they need. Now, many of the people that do this job are incredibly skilled, so I don't want to suggest that they don't have the skills. I've learned from Saket's book about Honduran roofers, about different communities that have particular skills that are utilized. Also have learned how all of this work of rebuilding in the aftermath of a crisis actually helps bring people together that maybe you never could have imagined. So in the South, in a very Republican area that perhaps is not pro-immigrant, what you're finding is relationships where somebody gets their home rebuilt by an immigrant, and it changes that human interaction and dynamic. So I think there are much bigger changes that happen at the broader level. So we have introduced this bill. When we introduced it last year, we had a tremendous amount of media interest because, believe it or not, there hasn't been any attention paid to this issue of climate resilience workforce. Not just climate resilience, not just in the way that Saket mentioned all the different ways that people think about resilience, not just spiritual resilience, right? But what does it take to actually plan for what's happening, to say that these disasters and what happens in the course of these disasters is not inevitable. We can do something to prevent some of this, and then to make sure that we're treating it as an opportunity to really bring people into a new kind of work. And so we've worked with labor unions, we've worked with organizations across the board. The workers and the resilience force was really instrumental in helping to craft this. And we have several dozen co-sponsors in the House, and we're going to introduce it again this year. And I think we're still trying to make sure that people understand why all these different pieces are critical and why we don't want to separate the bill into, it's part of the problem with intersectional work. The immigration part goes to the Judiciary Committee, and the workforce work goes to the Education and Labor Committee. But overall, we're thinking about a really exciting new vision for how we think about the disasters of climate change and the opportunity to mitigate and also to create new good-paying jobs and a new good-paying union workforce out of it. It's been a really fabulous project, and I think it's been one that's been crafted through the experience of the workers on the ground who have been doing this work. And so it's been really wonderful to hear the stories of these workers who, and maybe Saket can talk about this some more if we have time, but who literally travel from community to community doing this rebuilding. And most of the time, nobody even pays attention to them. Nobody knows who they are, nobody knows what their stories are, and nobody knows what they've actually done to allow a community to move forward in the face of disaster.
I'm
I'm Jamie Court. I'm the president of Consumer Watchdog. I'm going to talk about issue of housing insecurity that no one's brought up today, which is insurance. Because if you have a mortgage, you need insurance. If you're wanting to build a $50 million affordable housing project and you can't get insurance, you can't build the project. And unfortunately in California, we have insurance companies fleeing the state left and right. Literally, there was 100,000 non-renewals from 3 insurance companies in the last 2 weeks. They're non-renewing people. They're not offering new policies, and they're pointing a finger at climate change, at wildfires. Now, there's a big irony in this because the insurance companies have a big role in climate change. They have invested $113 billion in fossil fuels, $113 billion, and they've underwritten $3.6 billion in fossil fuel infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, drilling, and yet they're complaining about climate risk. We've been dealing with this in California for about 1.5 years, and it is a crisis. It is a crisis for people, and it's a crisis for people not only in wildfire areas but outside of wildfire areas. And what does the insurance industry want? They're on a capital strike. They're taking their capital out of California until they get what they want. Well, what do they want? They want deregulation, and they want a bailout. That's what they want. And they were pretty close to getting it last year, actually. They want 3 things very specifically. One is, if you don't get into a real insurance policy, you're stuck in a plan called the FAIR Plan, which is the insurer of last resort in California. And this is a policy that is very high deductible, high premium, low benefit. It covers only the basics. And the insurance companies actually have responsibility to pay on those claims. It's about 4% of the state now in this insurer of last resort, and it is tremendous insecurity in your housing because you're not sure you can rebuild, and there's a lot of perils that are not covered if you're in this plan. But the insurers are responsible. They wanted out of that responsibility. They wanted a bailout. They wanted to put the costs onto the consumers for that. Then they wanted 2 other things. They wanted to raise rates based on factors that are not allowed under our current regulation. We have the toughest insurance regulation in America. It saved $150 billion for consumers over the last 35 years, according to the Consumer Federation of America. It's a law called Prop 103. And yet, they want out of it, and they're using this opportunity with wildfire as an opportunity to exploit the climate change to get out of it. So they want it out of the bailout, but they also want 2 other things, really specifically. They want the right to use climate change modeling in their rate calculations, which wouldn't be bad if the climate change rate modeling was public. They want black box, unverifiable rate modeling, so you can't see it, but it'll justify higher rates. And then they want something else. They want to push reinsurance costs. These are the costs that insurers have when they don't want to insure the risk because it's too much. They go to Wall Street, and Wall Street will insure them for that extra risk, but they insure them at a very high premium because it's a risky endeavor. And they want to pass those costs on to the consumer. It is an unregulated market, the reinsurance market, a global reinsurance market. And it's basically like you go to Wall Street and you pay the VIG. And the insurance companies, if they could pass that cost on, they would be able to raise premiums 30, 40% overnight. That's the 3 things they've wanted. And last year, they almost got it in the legislature. Carmen Bulber and I fought it. Carmen's the executive director of Consumer Watchdog. And the insurance industry was meeting behind closed doors with our insurance commissioner. We know because we got the Public Records Act request showing it. And they developed a plan behind closed doors that they were ready to spring at the last 72 hours of the legislative session. It's called the Gut and Amend. And they were going to put all of this in that bill because we got the bill under Public Records Act. We know exactly what was in it. We know all the companies signed off on it. We know the commissioner was behind it. And the only thing that stopped that bill was a tape recording on a plane. There was a Southwest flight that Carmen and I happened to be on, and an insurance company lobbyist named Mike Gunning was on there, and he was bragging about how we are going to jam this bill through for a ballot in the last couple of days of session. And we happened to tape him. We released it to the media, and it blew up the deal. It blew up the deal. Literally blew up the deal. Unfortunately, within a short time after that, within days of the deal being blown up in the legislative session ending, Governor Newsom asked the commissioner under executive order to come up with another plan. And within hours of that executive order, the commissioner announced a deal with the industry to do it through the regulatory system, to raise rates or to rate insurance based on catastrophic black box modeling and adding reinsurance costs onto a policy. They couldn't do the bailout for the FAIR plan because that would take legislation. But we're waiting on the regulations now, and that's where we stand. And this is a serious issue. Florida did exactly that. They allowed for the passing on of black box modeling. They allowed for reinsurance cost. They also did a bailout, but of their insurer of last resort. And in Florida, the premiums for home insurance, the average premium for home insurance is $4,720. In California, it's $1,900. It's double. And their insurer of last resort has 20% of the business in Florida. We have 3% of the business, our insurer of last resort. So if they give the insurance companies everything they want, they do it anyway. But our commissioner has done this, and we're waiting on the regulations. And thankfully, 32 congressional representatives from California, including 2 who attended this conference, signed a letter to the commissioner outraged about it and saying, you got to be careful because Prop 103 has protected consumers. So to understand what we need to really do about this crisis, we need to go back to ask how much climate change has to do with what the insurers are saying they need in California. And if you go back, the data isn't good for the insurance companies because the insurance companies had some bad years in 2018. There were 4 fires in California. They were catastrophic, and there were huge losses. But that was 5 years ago. And on 2 of those fires, the utilities paid tens of billions of dollars back to the insurers because they caused the fires. Ever since then, the insurance companies have had very good years. Their profits in California were 4 or 5 times higher than anywhere else in America. And if you look back 20 years, their profits were literally, in over 20 years, they have an 8% rate of return in California and a 6% rate of return everywhere else. By any measure, they're doing better in California than everywhere else. And yet they're crying foul, and they've got a commissioner who may give them what they want. And that could mean big insecurity for consumers because in the wildfire areas, these premiums are outrageous anyway. You add on 30, 40%, it becomes unbearable. So what do we do about this crisis? We saw what happened with Florida. We saw what the industry wants. Well, we have a plan. Our plan is, and it goes back to some of the mitigation that these folks are talking about, we want to require that insurance companies cover everyone who hardens their home in California. If you invest in hardening home, if you invest in mitigation, you should have an insurance policy. And if the insurance companies don't want to play fair, they don't want to do that, they can get out of the state for 5 years, and they'll have to not only get out of the homeowners market, they get out of the car market too. So they're giving up all their business in the state if they don't want to insure people who harden their homes. And insuring people who harden their homes is the only way to protect really against the risk of wildfire. We know when you harden your home, you're 75% less likely for your home to catch on fire. We know for big projects, the builders representative testified, Dan Dunmore, before the legislature that for major housing projects, all of them who met code from 2010 on, not one has gone up in flames. So if we harden homes, if we invest in mitigation, we can beat the elements in large part. And in fact, the reason we haven't had a major catastrophe with wildfire since 2017, 2018 is we learned. We invested in mitigation. We invested in forest clearance. We invested not so much in home hardening, but in fire-safe communities. We invested, and we also invested in burying our utility lines and making sure the utilities trim their trees and doing all the mitigation stuff that needs to happen to protect against fires. And so we need public funds. We need more public funds for mitigation, there's no question. We need to reward people who mitigate. And we also need a commission to require that if you are going to build a building, it's in a safe area. It's not a risky fire area because developers will develop the cheapest land. We need to get that under control as well.
Which goes to the planning, and I think we're just, why don't we wait right there and open it up for questions, because I think what we're trying to do here is connect a number of different things. The bill includes hardening. It includes the workforce that performs the work, and it includes the planning that would ensure that you're not building in places that you shouldn't build in. And particularly, of course, it's always the poor folks and black and brown folks that end up in those spots. So I think you see the trend here, but why don't we open it up, because we only have about, I think, 10 minutes or so for questions, and see what thoughts and questions you have.
Thank you. You mentioned about the California commissioner, insurance commissioner.
Yeah.
That's Ricardo Lara, correct?
That's what?
That's Ricardo Lara?
Yes, it is.
I went to high school, went to college with him, know him very well.
Well, then you know what I'm talking about. No, I'm joking.
My question, I do have insurance. My question is, when does he run for re-election?
He ran for re-election, and he lost. A Democrat challenged him, a guy named Mark Levine, and lost by, I think it was 4,000 votes. Democrat on Democrat. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party endorsed Lara,
Correct.
and many labor groups endorsed Lara. Every editorial board in the state came out against Lara.
So we need to get some of this information
Yeah.
when we meet with labor and stuff, because I'm part of labor as
Yeah.
political director for AFT 1521, because this is really important to deal with. So
I will say, I think we have a better choice next time. A guy who carried the bill last year to have insurance companies insure everyone who owns their home was a guy named Mike McGuire, who became the Senate pro tem. So we're hoping he will carry this message forward this year. And he is also has a committee open for insurance commissioner, by chance.
Jane.
Can you explain, Saket or Pramila, what's hardening your homes? What can people do who have houses that don't understand that concept? How do you harden a home?
Should I take that? Well, hardening a home is part of a series of things you should do to prevent your home from going up in flames when there's a wildfire, right? There's two parts of it. The home hardening is one part. We are training workers, for example, who are going through our workforce development program in Sonoma County, getting certificates, becoming apprentices, all to go to a home and basically fix it up in such a way that it is fire resilient. You can take an existing home, add material to it, change doors, change windows, change trimming, build around it, take hedges and make sure there's enough space between the hedge and the home, paint roofs in such a way that flying embers won't land on roofs and inflame them. So there's a lot of things you can do to the home. There's also a lot of things you can do to the natural environment around the home. Clearing flammable vegetation, stewarding land, clearing dry vegetation, all of the things that weren't done that led to 4 fires in 2 years, 2 of which were directly caused by power companies. So that's all the work that is required in hardening homes. I will say this gets to, though, how do you pay for it? And the big idea I would put out is that in the coming years, we really need to have nothing less than a public option for resilience. That's really what you need. There is already a huge amount of public money for resilience. It's in FEMA. It's now in the bipartisan infrastructure law. You can get money to harden your homes. Most of that money is flowing to already wealthy people or flowing to municipalities that can apply. This is what is being corrected in Congresswoman Jayapal's legislation, which sends money directly to municipalities rather than through the state. And really, in the future, huge swaths of the country will need public money to make homes, not just repair homes, but make them resilient. The 2 governors who have used public money most effectively to actually make their constituents' homes resilient are the governors of Texas and Florida. They don't believe in climate change, but they have figured out how to use enormous amounts of HUD resources
That they didn't vote for.
Exactly. That they didn't
vote for those
exactly,
resources.
That they didn't vote for, to send them, not to Houston, where people of color live, right? But to Galveston. I mean, this is sort of, and we have to have a much more expansive conversation about how to use public money to do everything from home hardening to making even LA and cities like that more resilient.
And as we're building, because we're talking a lot about building new housing, as we're building that housing, we also have to be thinking about climate resilience as part of that, right? So when we're building whatever it is, we should be anticipating what's in front of us and doing the hardening as you build, or it's not hardening at that point, but it's building it in that way. Mm-hmm. So I think that's also important. And we don't have, there literally is no climate resilience planning money available. There is money that gets channeled to once there's been a disaster, right? Then maybe you can get some money. But what I've been finding in my conversations with cities in particular, and kind of smaller municipalities, because the big cities can manage to get money sometimes, but particularly for the smaller cities, nobody has any money available to think about what do we do when we know that sea level rise is coming, when we know that the planet is warming. I mean, the last report was that we have, our country has warmed 60% faster than any other place in the world. So we know this is coming, but we're not planning for it in any way. And again, the people that are most disproportionately affected, that don't get the money to harden their homes, that don't get the money, to even have homes in places where you should build homes. Most of those homes are in places where you shouldn't build. There's a real disparity that's created. And of course, if you're a renter, then you're just being moved into houselessness when this happens. And that's happened in every crisis, every disaster that we've seen.
I would say there are two sources of funding in California. One is the climate bond. And we want to get significant funding for mitigation in the climate bond that they're talking about putting on the ballot. And the other is the cap and trade program, because a lot of that money isn't very well spent. And activists could target both of those for the money for mitigation. And mitigation is really expensive. I mean, to harden a home, we're talking at least $10,000 to $30,000, right? It's expensive.
Yeah.
Congresswoman, thank you for that. I'm very curious about your bill, both last year's and this one. Did you specify any populations of workers in alignment with Saket's model?
Yes, that's exactly what we did. We looked at where is the workforce right now, and we specifically called out immigration and a path to citizenship, because the vast majority of the workers who are doing this work right now, this rebuilding work, are immigrant workers.
And did you get any pushback?
We haven't had pushback.
I'm surprised.
And we've actually, we had this plan that we haven't yet implemented, but to do field hearings in some of the places where, like red places, red localities, cities, where immigrants have rebuilt, to kind of change the narrative and to show that all of a sudden, even if you're, maybe even a MAGA Republican, if you have an immigrant from Nicaragua or Honduras or wherever who's rebuilding your home, you may feel differently about the need for those people to be able to stay. And so we haven't had pushback, but I will say it may be one of the reasons why we're working harder to get co-sponsors on the bill. I think we have 46 now. So check to make sure your representatives are on the bill, and if they aren't, get them on it. But I do think this is the workforce that we need. I mean, we need workers.
Well, that's very interesting. But a second before you say anything. So I'm a member of a California State Prison Commission. And one of the things, we're charged with reporting to the state legislature and the governor about the rehabilitation services provided to the inmates in our 32 state prison system. And there are a number of organizations that have contracts with the State Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to provide training. And so I'm wondering if, given your model with respect to former prisoners or current prisoners, if you have explored such organizations that may have contracts with the state to train prisoners.
Yeah, we absolutely have. A training infrastructure in prisons is very important. Done right, it's a source of reducing recidivism. We know that. Studies have shown that. At the same time, these trainings have to be done through a justice lens. There are programs that put prisoners to work, doing work for no or very few wages, cents to an hour, and we're not a big fan of that. But overall, just to build on what Congresswoman Jayapal was saying, in terms of the pushback, this is an example of where the conversation in DC is very different from the conversation in, say, the Florida Panhandle or rural Louisiana. What I've seen is when undocumented immigrant workers come to a city that is torn apart by a hurricane, they are treated like the white blood cells of that area. They are nothing less than healers. Residents, homeowners who saw immigrants as the enemy before their home was destroyed now are full of gratitude. They want to learn their stories. They want to build. And so there is this profound opening for justice in the wake of a disaster, and not just after a disaster, but just in the context of our climate crisis. Yeah. There's an opening for justice that I think this bill is trying to take, and we're all trying to take. That this is an opening where I would say resilience is a framework that can accelerate housing justice, justice for the incarcerated, justice for immigrants. And that's what we should all be trying to do, is look at how resilience is a real majoritarian framework, maybe one of the last left in our country. And inside of that, there is so much consensus, and we can push justice in many, many ways.
Beautiful. Well, I think that is it for our time, but thank you so much. We appreciate it.